A number of you have joined Toby earlier on in the day, and Toby is becoming a sort of mentor and guide on the side for whole education, and he's working with us afterwards. We've always been determined that our conferences are a catalyst and a tip of the iceberg, and Toby's going to work with us on where we take some of the things and how we communicate some of the outcomes for today. So we've asked him both to reflect on that and also respond to our challenge and title. So Toby, thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you very much, David, and it's great to be here. I am a big fan of whole education. I think the whole kind of holding the whole education in view and keeping that sense of whole education is critical at a time when potentially accountability and other pressures can narrow our focus. The kind of short version of what I want to say is that if we're going to seize the agenda, I think we face a set of systemic challenges and some future-focused challenges which are significant. I'm sure you're all aware of that. And I think we have a very autonomous school system by international standards, a very accountable school system by international standards. And whilst there may be a tendency or a pressure to focus on our single schools at a time of change like this, my argument is really that we need to think differently and move thinking about collaboration to a different level if we're going to address some of these challenges. We've talked about some of them today. The fact that real terms funding is reducing 9%, 12%, depending on which IFS report you read. The fact that we're in the middle of this transition. You said, Tim, this morning, the kind of move to a new time of partnership, but we're quite a long way from that point at this point in time. I wrote an article recently in the London Review of Education where it was based on 2 reviews I did last year of local authorities in England, and I called it more fragmented and yet more networked. I think at one and the same time we're seeing localities kind of breaking down and becoming more fragmented as schools decide more for themselves how they're going to work, where they're going to work, who they're going to work with. And yet, I think in the main, as I travel around and in the research projects I'm doing, I do see that schools are absolutely networking and working together more and seeing that that is a critical way forward. But equally, as this gentleman suggests, I mean, you said, David, you talked this morning about ostriches and heads in the sand. Equally, I think we could talk about chickens and being headless at a time when change is so acute and so the hurricanes are so fast-paced. How do we try and keep our heads? And arguably, this is a time when we need leadership more than ever. And for me, that leadership needs to start by stepping back always and understanding what's the context, what's going on, where do we sit, and what are the wider opportunities and challenges that we need to consider. And we could debate what you might put at any of these levels of the system. But I think what's interesting is when you then start to draw lines between those levels, that you can see how something like globalisation, which is changing the way that we live, the way that we work, the way that we consume, or in almost every aspect, feeds through at a national level to an obsession with competitiveness. I think a recognition, the session we had with John Dunford and everyone around closing the gap, that we can no longer have school systems that educate a few children to run the country while everyone else does the work. We need systems which enable every child to achieve their best so that we can compete on the global stage. That then leads to the obsession, within localities of how do we make sure every school is at least a good school, that we're closing the gap, that we're helping every child to exceed. And what it can feel like to you as leaders in schools is that it's about a top-down process of policy change, and your job is simply to try and respond to and implement and adapt to those changes as they come at you. I think what's interesting is when you draw a different set of lines and think about some of these global challenges that we face, some of which are already impacting in very real and significant ways, I'm sure, for you in schools. If you're in Tower Hamlets or in Birmingham, for example, you could think about that second global challenge, the clash of civilizations, and how as school leaders you're having to respond to that. But on any of those challenges, that's where the real heart of your role as leaders is to try and understand what does that mean, And when we put that together with the fact that about a third of the cohort starting school today will live on into the 22nd century, how do we start to think about education which will prepare children for that kind of world which we can't yet imagine? And any of you who know the work of Keith Grint and people like that who do a lot of work around leadership across public sector and more widely, this notion of tame problems and wicked issues. So a tame problem is a problem that has been solved before, and broadly we know what to do. We know that if you follow the plan, if you do these things in this order, then you can be reasonably confident of the outcome that you'll get. You could argue that school improvement is a tame problem. We know what's involved, we know how people do it. By contrast, a wicked issue is a problem that no one has yet faced, no one yet knows the answer to, and arguably, therefore, as leaders, we need a different kind of leadership. It's not about management of a process, it's about what's often called adaptive leadership. How do we bring people together who are involved in solving this challenge, whatever it may be? How do we define the challenge sufficiently that we can understand what it is and where we might want to get to next? And how do we learn our way into the future, try out things, evaluate them, see what works, hopefully get better as we go? And I want to just give an example of one adaptive challenge, one wicked issue that I think you face in schools, before talking a bit about the policy context and some of the risks, I think, around how are we helping leaders to address some of these fundamental challenges. So I want to go back to what in his time was a newfangled technology called literacy and reading. And Socrates was he feared this newfangled technology. He believed passionately in the importance of the teacher-student relationship. And he worried that only real truth, the kind of virtue of real truth you got at through dialogue. He talked about living speech versus the dead discourse of written language. He worried that the written text would lead to the destruction of memory, that once you write something down, you can forget it. Whereas for him, his students would have been required to memorize vast swathes of Homeric verse or whatever. He worried about the loss of control. Once you wrote something down, it went out into the world, somebody could read it. Without that teacher-student relationship to interpret and get under the skin of it, would there be real learning? Would there be real meaning? He was mentor to Plato. We don't know what Plato thought about reading and writing, but we do know that he recorded the Socratic dialogues, and he was then mentor to Aristotle, who described himself as immersed in the habit of reading. An example is from Proust and the Squid, which is a fantastic book on the reading brain and how our brains develop in reading. And so, thinking about that newfangled technology, I want to suggest that we are in a not dissimilar position today in terms of new technology, the social media that we've just been talking about. And I know that as a parent of 3 children, 2 teenagers, I worry about the vacuous stuff that they do online, the loss of memory, the lack of interrogation of meaning and so on that can go on when they're texting a bot and having prolonged conversation with a bot rather than with a real human being, for example. I guess for you as leaders in schools, the challenge is how do you both respect and retain the best that's been thought and said, the kind of curriculum that we know is hugely valuable and that equips children for work and life, whilst at the same time engaging constructively, not being the Socrates of this story, so that actually you adapt the pedagogy, the learning, the experience of children in your school, so that in 20 years' time we don't look back and think how quaint it was that we banned mobile phones in the classroom and how much like Socrates that was. And I think the particular risk is that if you think about that as a future-focused challenge that we're all grappling with, but we're struggling to find time and space to focus on in our leadership and in our schools, part of the reason for that is because we have this welter of policy change coming at us. This is from Ruth Lupton's review of the coalition policy changes. And you all know this far better than me about all those changes and how, what a whirlwind that can feel like. And one of the things that's interesting for me is how much of that is still only just happening now, 2015, 2016, in terms of particularly the curriculum and assessment reforms. And we know from the research around curriculum reform around the world that it takes something like 5 years for a school system to really get to grips with a new curriculum, to really embed it, understand what it is, how you can make it work. And if your attention and energy is drawn into this implementation effort, how do you at the same time keep headspace for addressing some of those wider challenges? And I think now, thinking about the international projects I'm working on in a 7-nation study on school autonomy and curriculum innovation at the moment, where what seems very clear is that in our push for school autonomy and stripping away the quangos, the local authorities, the agencies and so on that traditionally under the Labour government were there to help schools to implement change, to understand what was required and to support them with some of that change, I worry that we've stripped away our capacity for systemic innovation, or at least we've created a system in which some schools get it and some schools do understand what needs to be done and have the wherewithal to make the best of that new context, and yet many schools don't. I wrote a blog a couple of weeks ago looking at the implementation of the teaching of Chinese, and there's a great report which published last year, and it looks at the development of Chinese teaching across the 4 UK nations. And what struck me was that in Scotland, they have worked nationally to ensure that teacher training providers are beginning to train up teachers of Chinese. They've got local authority hubs which bring schools together to support schools to introduce Chinese into the curriculum. And that's necessary because as a school, if you can't recruit teachers, if you can't understand what it looks like, you haven't got a curriculum, you haven't got an assessment framework, that kind of systemic innovation is hard to do on your own as a school. In Scotland, about 1 in 20 primaries is now teaching Chinese in one way, shape or form. By contrast, in England, it's about 1 in 160 that's teaching Chinese. So I think our ability to innovate as a system may be being fractured quite significantly in this system that we're now in. One of the other challenges with responding to policy as a leader and how do you judge and make decisions about how you respond to policy is, I think, illuminated by this slide from Rob Coe's inaugural lecture, which you might have seen before. It's quite a complicated slide. What it shows is all of England's results on PISA, TIMSS and PIRLS since the mid-90s when they began. And the individual thin lines don't matter significantly here. The point that it's making is that we've pretty much flatlined. We haven't seen big improvements on international benchmarking surveys since we began participating in those. By contrast, what this pink line shows is improvement in 5As to C GCSE with equivalence over the course of the 2000s. And it has to raise a question of how can it be that on our national assessment measure we seem to be making this remarkable rapid progress, and yet on international surveys we're not making progress. And of course you all know that the push under the Labour government was absolutely that we were only getting better if 5As to C was going up year on year, and a school could surely only be getting better if its 5As to C was going up every year. And yet we know from Alison Wolf's report shortly after the 2010 election that often those equivalents, the GNVQs or whatever it might be, were the thing that were being used to push up those results. And yet, in reality, in terms of increasing your chances of getting a job or your prospects in the labour market, many of those qualifications were not as valuable as some of the GCSE qualifications they were being judged against. And so I think as leaders, we have to think very hard, how do we respond to policy? Are we doing it because it's the right thing to do? And what is the right thing to do for our children, for the children that we're responsible for? And how do we work in this complex environment? This is from Becky Allen, a colleague of mine at the Institute, now set up Education Data Lab, where she tracks one group of children, all of whom got 2B over here in their Key Stage 1 SATs, and she then tracks them through to see how did they do at Q Stage 2 and how did they do at GCSE. What's fascinating, I find this slide fascinating, is the sense that they went in so many different directions, both at Key Stage 2 and even more so at Key Stage 4. And you know this, but I think policymakers often assume that this is a linear journey that children are on, that if schools do certain things in certain ways, then they will get predictable outcomes. And yet the reality is that each learning journey is fundamentally different, and how schools help children to get those very best outcomes and make the best of that learning journey is absolutely about high quality teachers who are passionate, motivated, supported, given the support that they need in order to develop the skills to really help every child to thrive. I used this slide in my workshop earlier. Broadly, it's from the London Challenge, although slightly adapted, the 8 pillars of what do we see in great schools, the kind of shared vision, values and culture, world-class teaching and learning, exceptional professional development and so on, which you all recognise. I think we do know and we feel it when we walk into some schools. What does a great school look like? We equally recognise that in a self-improving system, school-to-school support, helping every school to achieve that, ensuring that we move learning, capacity, expertise around between schools is fundamental if we want all schools to achieve and we want every child to achieve. I think that's beginning to become part of how we work. I think there's still further to go. I think the fact that the accountability system focuses you very heavily on your own school and what Ofsted is going to think of your school and whether or not you've hit the floor targets and so on means that it pulls you back from participating in peer review and some of the collaborative activity that you might feel would help your school to improve, but you're also in competition with each other. But what I want to argue is that it's not just this agenda now that we need to think about. We need to think about some of these other challenges that we face in the system that I've got on the left-hand side of this slide, and many of which we've touched on today. And what strikes me when you put that against what's on the right of the slide in terms of the Conservative manifesto commitment for the May election is that the policy responses don't seem to add up to how do we address some of these significant challenges. We have 900,000 additional pupils coming into the system. We have a tighter funding climate. We know, as Tim said, that we face teacher shortages and significant recruitment challenges, and so on and so forth. And I would question if you think that policy is going to solve any of these problems for you. I'm not sure it is. So I think increasingly, as I say, the onus is on you to think strategically, how do we address these challenges? And my sense is that many of these challenges, like the teaching of Chinese, are not challenges you can easily solve on your own in your school. It's through your networks, through your partnerships, by working together that you'll begin to be able to recruit and develop the next generation of teachers, to find efficiencies in terms of how you reduce your budgets, to develop the next generation of leaders, and so on. Now, I could talk for hours about the policy framework. This is from my inaugural lecture last year. I think the point I would make is that, of course, it does pull against that type of collaboration. It makes some of that collaboration more difficult. In my lecture, I said that there were 4 parallel policy narratives running at the same time. The first I call world-class no excuses, and this is where a minister has been off to Shanghai or Singapore or somewhere like that and comes back and says, well, they get better results and they have longer school days. They have a more demanding, content-heavy curriculum. And so we need that. We need more rigorous assessment. We need to get rid of teacher assessment, and we need proper rigorous external assessment, and so on and so forth. And we're going to have accountability measures which force schools to improve, and if you're not up to it, then we'll take you over, you'll lose your job, you'll be run by someone else. So face the consequences. The second narrative is the freedom to teach narrative. This is all about academies and freedoms. Because you're autonomous, because you can recruit who you want, you don't need to have qualified teacher status, because you can pay them what you want, because you can train your own teachers as a skit or through School Direct and so on, you'll get better. We trust you, it's all over to you. The third is the market-based approach. If parents aren't happy with your school or with the choice of schools within their locality, then they should be able to set up and run a new free school. And that will force provision to improve, that will increase choice and contestability within local markets. And then lastly, system leadership. We're going to designate 1,000 national leaders of education, 500 teaching schools and so on, and we want the best leaders to help all schools to improve. But because we have this focus on single schools in our accountability framework, because of the parallel narratives running together, which actually increase competitive pressures at the same time as trying to encourage collaboration, it can be very hard for you as leaders to navigate that space, to work and build trust and so on between schools. And yet I think, although the evidence on collaboration is only still developing, I don't want to oversell this evidence. I think it's strongest where we can see that shared governance through federations, school-to-school support type arrangements. There's some recent studies around the impact of national leaders of education, for example, which do show that where you have focused schools working together with a focus on teaching and learning and building capacity and sharing expertise and so on, then you absolutely do get improvement. But equally, some of the bigger partnerships, some of the more developmental, open-ended partnerships, it's harder to track that impact. Not impossible, but harder to see. And we know increasingly, I think, what it is that leaders do who lead these kind of partnerships. They're able to move from leading a single institution where they have executive power and control, and they may be very distributive in their style and collaborative and so on. But as you move out to try and work together, you have to give up some of that hierarchical power and think about leadership through influence, about building trust, co-creating solutions, understanding the needs of different contexts and different players within your locality and so on, and persevering and creating real, tangible, collaborative work which begins to build the culture that you want to see. And yet, in this policy context that I'm describing, in my inaugural lecture, I argued that I could see two scenarios playing out. One is taken from the books by Philip Reeve, Mortal Engines, which are fantastic books if you haven't read them, and you should find some teenagers to read them to. So in this post-apocalyptic world, London is the first city to move itself onto wheels, and it starts trundling around, eating up the smaller towns and cities and turning their citizens into slaves. And over the centuries, this whole notion of kind of municipal Darwinism or institutional Darwinism evolves, in which the strongest gobble up the weakest. Is it that scenario that we see playing out? Sometimes as I travel around, I think it is. At other times, though, it's more about the Tour de France. Cyclists on the best machines money can buy, coached, supported to be the best they can be, but working as a team, taking turns to go in front to break the wind resistance, all stop. If the lead rider gets a puncture, they all stop and wait. If they win, they share the prize money and so on. So they work as individuals, but they also work as a team. I think if we're going to get to a Tour de France model, then we have to think about what kinds of leadership do we need to display and need to try and enact in our localities. I'm doing a large study looking at the development of the self-improving school system at the moment, which we publish next June. But broadly, my worry is that I think we see that it's very much down to you as leaders to try and make sense and to shape these partnerships which can address some of these systemic challenges. I see some leaders who are absolutely over here on the right. They're proactive. They have the kind of unwarranted optimism, as Tim talks about it. They can create pragmatic visions. They're collective. They look outwards. They undertake peer review, even though they know it's about sharing their trade secrets and so on. They try to build, by working with other schools, they build capacity in their own schools and share that capacity. And they make decisions based on shared values, moral purpose, drawing on evidence and so on. And yet at the same time, I see this tendency to be over on the left as well. Schools that are reactive, fatalist about what's going on, fearful about what might happen to them, individually focused, competitive, often the heads who suffer most, I think, from stress and burnout because they feel that the weight is all on their shoulder, and if they leave their school for a day, then it might all fall apart and go wrong. and too much about compliance focus. What does Ofsted want? What's everyone else doing? If that's it, then I'd better do it. So I think my argument essentially is we face a time when we need more, not less, leadership to solve some systemic challenges and some real challenges that are facing us here today. I want to finish with something from Robin Alexander. He wrote an excellent piece for the National College a few years ago. He said, educational leaders may be judged effective if their strategies achieve specific, measurable objectives, such as improved pupil attendance, SAT scores, and GCSE results. They may be judged principled if, at the same time, they pursue a larger educational vision and do not allow this to be compromised by important but inevitably narrow measures of effectiveness and accountability. They may be judged exemplary if they themselves also model, in the ways they think, talk, and act, the attributes of an educated person. They may be judged outstanding if, and only if, they're successful in all of the first three senses. He's deliberately trying to introduce a model of outstanding which moves us beyond simply delivering results, which I think is important. For me, it's about increasingly, and they are able to shape and contribute to partnerships which help to solve some of the systemic challenges we face. Thank you very much.